Sonic the Hedgehog fans versus outside opinions and criticism. A war that never ceases. But who cares now? Sonic's reputation is the best it's been in a while. It currently has some successful Hollywood films, TV shows, and well-received games. It's doing fine. If you are only in your little online bubble. Because Snoop Dogg rocking a Sonic chain and Jim Carrey and Keanu Reeves starring in Hollywood Sonic movies isn't enough for the general public, because there's a mysterious realm beyond the screens of Twitter and Reddit and YouTube called the real world that's very different. General audiences still don't think very highly of Sonic. Like, for example, one time I was hanging out with somebody who saw that someone's Spotify Wrapped had Sonic Mania music in it and made a comment about how Sonic was weird and dumb. That was only last year. Or when I was having a conversation with a friend a few months ago, and the topic of conversation somehow came to Sonic, and he jokingly said that he would disown his kids if they got into Sonic, and that he would go back in time to prevent Sonic from existing so that Chris Chan wouldn't exist. But he said that the NES games in Sonic Mania looked fun. Or heading back to the internet, when Adult Swim recently posted a meme where they put Sonic fans at the 9th circle of hell, below all these fandoms. Even though there's lots of jokes and fun, it's quite clear that no, Sonic's reputation in the general public is still not very good. Now, if you're a Sonic fan watching this, you're probably sitting there, glasses getting all steamy from heavy breathing, agitated at the fact that people don't like something that you do. No, Sonic isn't dumb. Sonic wasn't on the NES. Sonic fans are cool. They make cool fan games. And this is the stance a large amount of the Sonic fandom takes. Don't try to understand why the thing you like has such a negative reputation. Just exert massive amounts of hostility against any of the criticism. While this obviously doesn't apply to all of them, a huge portion of Sonic fans have a serious problem with mistaking criticism and jokes with toxicity and hostility towards them. I usually stay away from this discussion, but I naturally can't since I'm now a silly guy who expresses my silly opinions online. But when I was a kid, I would also get angry when I saw Sonic get criticized. But then, well, I grew up. When I finally got back into the franchise, I understood where the backlash came from, but I also understood why I and so many other people loved it in the first place even better. But a large portion of the Sonic fanbase never wants to hear any criticism out, and then they wonder why the entire fanbase is a laughingstock of the internet. So I decided to make this video to explain why Sonic has such a bad reputation in the eyes of the general public, and why I think the criticisms are more often than not understandable to most people, and a good thing, using game design philosophies to explain it, while also explaining why people love Sonic in the first place along the way. I'm not trying to change opinions, I'm just trying to explain these sides. Well, what can I use as an example? Why not talk about the most divisive game in the franchise, Sonic Adventure 2? I understand both sides of the argument here regardless of where I personally stand. Why so many people love this game and why so many people hate it. People love it because it has the most content of any Sonic game, and a huge variety of content at that. But I personally value quality over quantity when it comes to my gaming experiences. I prefer that if a game wants to include a bunch of content, all of that content should be of a more substantial quality. Sure, it may have less enjoyable things to do than a bigger game, but I prefer when the entire package is consistent quality-wise throughout. But I understand why other people don't mind that. The other reason people like this game is because of nostalgia, which is perfectly valid and I completely understand, but I'll get to that later. It's also very ambitious and creative, but I also understand why people dislike the game. The variety of playstyles vary in quality, though which one you like and dislike the most varies person to person, and a lot of the extra missions have a level of crypticness not seen since the mid-80s. Radical Highway Mission 3. Personally for me, there's a lot of things I love about the game and a lot of things I hate, so I'm personally more in between. But even for a game I hate, I can understand why people like it, and even for a game I like, I can understand why people don't like it. And you can do that while still disagreeing. Now that I've established the importance of trying to understand different opinions that people may have, I think it's time to get into the unholy trinity of common criticisms that are often levied towards the series, much to the chagrin of angry fans. Also, get used to the whole Trinity trio things coming in threes thing, because that will be a common theme throughout this video, like Sonic Heroes. I had to relate it back to Sonic somehow. These criticisms are misplaced, but I still understand the root of them. The first one is the complaint about Sonic's stupid friends. A lot of people take this as critics disliking the characters, which is absolutely correct. Sonic fans love defending their Amy Roses and Charmy Bees and Big the Cats and Shadow the Hedgehogs, and a common thread through a lot of these defenses is trying to justify the character's actions in-universe as if these criticisms are aimed at the morals of real individuals rather than the entertainment value they gain from these fictional characters. People just find these characters annoying, and they are well within their right to feel that way and express that. Just because Amy and Charmy aren't annoying in such and such game, or Big isn't annoying in the glorious original Japanese version, doesn't change the fact that these people are criticizing what they experience by itself. But the wider criticism about Sonic's stupid friends comes from how they play. Here's a criticism that I've never heard levied at the series, but I think puts the issue into perspective. Sonic Adventure 2, and many other Sonic games, feels like a licensed game, specifically in the fact that the game is built around the story rather than the gameplay. Sure, you can do the math and see that there's 9 treasure hunting stages, 9 mech stages, 10 running stages, and the 2 driving stages, so it's almost balanced, but the structure is still all over the place. Hero's story starts balanced enough with the first 3 stages being one each of the 3 main gameplay styles, but Knuckles doesn't get a boss, and then we get 2 Sonic stages in a row. Meanwhile, the Dark story completely lacks structure from the start, only having the player switch to whichever character has the next plot moment. Now, I know why they did this. The game was originally meant to only have 3 characters. Check out my video about that. And they were likely going to have 9 stages each. But when they added Tails, Rouge, and Shadow, they split the stages between characters. And since each of the 6 campaigns would be way too short, they decided to split it into 2 campaigns with 3 characters each. Sega completely struggled with implementing other characters into Sonic games, either having way too much variety where you go from players reaching a goal to players reaching 3 goals, which was a major pace breaker for a lot of people, or go from action platforming to fishing, or having barely any variety, requiring players to play the same stages with few changes 4 times with characters with the exact same abilities. So they gave up altogether. They tried to keep the variety while still keeping Sonic the only character out of fear of backlash, while still cutting down on the number of gameplay styles. Meanwhile, and I hate to be this guy, fans have created games like Sonic Roboblast 2 where they literally just translated the classic format of all characters playing the same with different abilities into 3D, and it works pretty well. The second common criticism is that Sonic is inherently flawed. I'm actually going to save discussing this one for later, but I want you to keep it in mind throughout this video. The last criticism, which is still kind of related to the last one and which transitions into my next section perfectly, is that Sonic doesn't control well in 3D. This criticism is false, but still true to an extent. The problem isn't that Sonic doesn't control well in 3D, it's the level design. Now we have to talk about another trio. The 3 types of video game control: 2D, first person, and third person. Okay, technically there aren't 3. 2D could either mean side-scrolling, top-down, or belt-scrolling. An isometric perspective is a combination of 2D and 3D. First person is first person. Meanwhile, third person could mean 2 things. Either you have a fixed camera like Crash Bandicoot, or a controllable camera like Super Mario 64. What did Sonic Team go with when designing Sonic Adventure? A mix of both.
Oh, and don't worry if the view suddenly changes. It does that sometimes.
You can control the camera, but the levels are so linear it won't matter, and the camera's automatic shifts cause problems, which I'll elaborate more on later. Sonic moves too fast for these small levels, but the controls on their own work great, and you can't deny that the homing attack is a brilliant idea. Bravo, Sonic team. They later fixed this problem by changing the controls, but not changing the way stages were designed. In the Boost games, Sonic is nowhere near as swervy as he is in the Adventure era games, but the level designs are still fairly linear. Along with the relative linearity, the Adventure era games have an obsession with bottomless pits, which were a rarity in the classic 2D games for a reason, which are much harder to ignore with the swervy controls and speedy characters. Sonic is too fast for bottomless pits to be around. It would be easier to name the levels that don't have them. In fact, every single running stage in Sonic Adventure 2 has bottomless pits in it. The reason the Boost games were so much better received than the Adventure games is because while they also have linear stages filled with bottomless pits, the controls are much more suited to dealing with them and much more accessible. While Sonic Adventure 2 does have a feature where the characters teeter off of ledges if they run too close to the edge, that doesn't apply if you're mid-air. The stiffer controls of the Boost games work better if you're going to have linear levels filled with bottomless pits, while the Adventure games controls were much better suited to wider environments, which did exist, especially in Sonic 06 strangely enough, but were a rarity, not counting hub worlds. That's not to say 3D Sonic games don't have alternate paths and shortcuts, but there is the problem of them focusing so much on spectacle and scripted events. And this is a problem dating back to the 2D games. Sonic was conceived around being a good speedrunning game, but Sonic 3 and Knuckles has way too many set pieces and chase scenes that go on for a specific amount of time. Except there you don't need to worry about a camera. So what if we just got rid of the cinematic scripted events entirely and had the spectacle come from the gameplay, like Green Hill Act 1 from Sonic 1? Well, I'm gonna be that guy again, but Sonic Roboblast 2 does this well, with very open-ended stages. Now, you would think that this would mean that the stages are very big, but they actually aren't, and they mask this by being a lot more maze-like, and by relying on players skillfully using momentum to get through stages. The only annoying thing is that you have to control the character and the camera at the same time, which can be too annoying for some people, but it works surprisingly well given how fast the characters move. But that momentum system was hard to pull off in the early days of 3D and still kind of is, so I absolutely can't blame Sonic Team for not going that route. However, the wide open levels wouldn't have been a problem, as like I said, they do a good job at covering up how small they are. But I think Sega could solve the issue of stages seeming too short by making every stage a collectathon like the treasure hunting stages in the Sonic Adventure games. But not exactly like that. That's what Nintendo did with Mario. Since it would be so much harder to create loads of levels where Mario has to get to a singular goal, they gave the player multiple challenges to overcome in a few small playgrounds. Imagine a truly 3D version of Sonic 3D Blast with multiple characters and more interesting environments. Thankfully, it seems after 24 years, they finally made an open-ended Sonic game. But I think people should understand that third-person games with camera control are the hardest games to get into, especially for gamers who grew up without them. 2D is extremely simple and easy to understand, as you only have 4 directions to go in, without really needing to worry about a camera. Third person with a fixed camera also has this same level of simplicity. First person is a bit trickier and requires a bit more hand-eye coordination, but it's also very easy to understand because it's just like how we experience our real lives. But third person with camera control is extremely complex. But if that's the case, then how come Grand Theft Auto V, a game which is primarily controlled in third person with camera controls, is one of the best-selling games of all time? Simple. GTA doesn't usually strive for difficulty, but Sonic did and Mario did, and there's so much more room for error in third-person games with camera control. You see, Super Mario 64 doesn't have the same reputation in Japan that it does in the rest of the world. Part of this has to do with the Nintendo 64 being the only time Nintendo lost the console wars in its home country, thanks to Nintendo's decision to make the system cartridge-based, which infuriated RPG developers, aka Japan's favorites, who preferred the CD-ROM format as it gave them the freedom to create more ambitious games. As such, the 3D Mario games were usually seen as kiddie crap over there, something I will come back to. But aside from that, it was just harder for older gamers to go from the simplicity of moving a character left to right to moving a camera alongside 360-degree control of a character. Nintendo tried to make this easier by basically telling the player that they were controlling two characters, Mario and Lakitu holding the camera, but this was just too complex for some people. This is what influenced Nintendo to try to make more 2D Mario games and make the 3D ones more accessible. But Sonic games have the highest focus on difficulty because Sega is an arcade game maker first, and that's what their bread and butter is. And as handholdy as the 3D Sonic games can be sometimes, they still leave a lot of room for error, and thus the games are more than just hard for people who aren't used to the control style to get used to. They're janky. This is why games like Sonic Forces and Sonic 4 are reviled within the fandom, but critics don't mind them nearly as much. Most of these critics are older and find this Sonic Adventure type games too difficult to control. So when Sonic goes back to a simple 2D one-button format, or when it has very linear and simple level designs that are easy to control, albeit at the risk of losing a lot of replay value, critics don't mind. They're simply just older and more used to 2D games, and there's nothing wrong with that, because gaming journalists aren't supposed to represent the general public. These publications are made up of tons of people, never one representative. IGN is not a singular entity that despises Sonic. It's a bunch of different people voicing their own opinion. And while there definitely are politics involved, their opinions aren't exclusive to themselves, as there are other older gamers who are more used to 2D games who find games like Sonic Adventure games too difficult to control. While gaming publications may be focused solely on clicks, and honestly, a lot of professional journalists suck at games regardless of whether they're 2D or 3D, and while Let's Players may make your favorite game look bad by playing it poorly trying to be funny, it doesn't take away from the fact that there really are people who just find games like this too hard to get used to, and their opinions are perfectly valid. And now I want to discuss another trio, the three appeals of video games, the needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness.
Hey, I saw that game theory video too!
But if you didn't, hopefully you learned something new from this section of the video. Competence is almost squarely where the appeal of Sonic falls in. The need for competence is met by a challenge. But what if I told you that there are people who don't like Sonic because of the way it handles this aspect? No, not because it's too hard. Because it's too easy. These people grew up with the NES era of games, where most games were poorly designed and were just meant to take forever as a way to seem like they were worth the asking price. But even then, let's take a look at a well-designed game from that era, like Super Mario Bros. When you get hit, it's devastating. You lost your ability to take another hit and or your weapon. The challenge came from how quickly you recovered from your mistake. Do you get back on your feet as soon as possible or perform worse thanks to the trauma of your mistake? It's actually basically just like Tetris. If you place a piece in a weird spot, do you recover immediately and work around it? Or do you start dropping more pieces in bad places? In Sonic, that's almost completely absent. Your character is practically invincible. Stages are littered with rings and you can just get hit as many times as you want. The only real hazards are getting crushed, drowning, or the rare and hard to come across bottomless pits. Seriously, if you think Sonic is too hard, don't play anything that came before. Sonic is probably the easiest 2D platformer series not called Kirby. As such, a lot of older gamers don't get that challenge that they want from it. But 2D Sonic does suffer from a bit of unfair difficulty. But here's the thing, the trial and error difficulty is more of a mild annoyance in a game like Sonic than it is in Mega Man, where it is extremely punishing. Not only that, there's a mechanic that almost completely circumvents this problem but the addition of other mechanics made it so that most players, even the best, ignore this mechanic altogether. Let's take a look at what Sonic can do in Sonic 1. He can go left, he can go right, he can look up, he can look down, and he can jump. That's it, right? You forgot about one thing. Rolling. Rolling will prevent you from running into stuff you don't want to, but the game doesn't teach you this mechanic well. While Green Hill Act 1 does a great job at teaching players the mechanics of the game, the first time you roll, the game does it automatically for you, thus not teaching players how to properly. And I just lied. Green Hill Act 3 actually does teach you how to roll when you're met with a nasty wall you can't get through. The problem is that there's an easy way out with a spring on a platform that can bring you to a higher platform. But it's okay, as long as they don't introduce any mechanics that trivialize the importance of rolling. Well, I hate to say this, I really do, but the holy savior of Sonic was actually not the best addition. The spin dash instantly gifts your character with momentum and makes them roll. The only problem is that players have to halt to do it. This gave so many people the idea that Sonic was about speed, due to how much the spin dash trivializes gaining momentum. The roll, on the other hand, requires you to gain momentum already to use it. Ew! While you have to stop to use the spin dash, it's also much quicker to use. Since people don't want to stop to do the spin dash, but would rather do it than gain momentum, most people forget about rolling and run into stuff and complain about it. And this isn't me saying you suck at the game, it is 100% the game's fault for trivializing its own very important mechanics. I feel like a way this could be fixed is by making Sonic horrendously ugly so players would want to keep him in a ball form to avoid seeing his face. I kid. It's not a surefire way of making sure you don't get hit, but it alleviates a lot of the cases where you might. Keep in mind that I don't hate the spin dash and that this is a minor thing, but next time you play the OG version of Sonic 1, just remember, the game doesn't hate you, it wants you to do better. Now let's talk about the second appeal, the need for autonomy. Basically, games that let you do whatever you want with the tools they provide you. The easiest and most obvious example is Minecraft. But I think a really good comparison for Sonic is, once again, Super Mario Bros., which satisfies the needs for competence and autonomy perfectly in tandem. After the first level teaches you the basics of the game's mechanics, the second level lets you experiment and lets you set your own difficulty through the use of warp points. You can also create your own challenges by going through the game without picking up coins, power-ups, or by being a pacifist. Sorta. The 2D Sonic games shockingly retain this, at least to some extent, despite the fact that it doesn't make much sense. In Mario, it makes total sense why you would want to take a pacifist run, as it's implied that the enemies are living creatures just doing their jobs. But in Sonic, not destroying the enemy robots is a bad thing in-universe, as the animals are trapped in there. Of course, they didn't want to make a 2D side-scrolling, fast-paced platformer about going around and exploring to destroy things, so they wrote around this by creating the Chaos Emeralds. Bravo, Sonic Team. Of course, they implemented autonomy and in turn variety in their own unique way by giving players multiple ways to get through stages. Unfortunately, this kind of design doesn't work as well as you'd think. For one, there's one correct way to go through some levels. You're lying if you say you aren't going through Green Hill Act 1 the exact same way every time. This sucks because this means developers put a lot of detail into places players will never go to. I think Sonic 2 does this the best. The very simple 2 to 3 lane design means that there's not a wrong way of going through the stages. But Sonic 1 does something better than Sonic 2 and 3 and Knuckles in regards to giving players autonomy. Despite its reputation as the slow Sonic game, it's actually the best one to speedrun. Sonic 2 has things like Sky Chase that will always take a certain amount of time to complete, and Sonic 3 and Knuckles is filled with chase scenes and cinematic scenes that take the same amount of time to finish. Sonic 3 and Knuckles also fails to give the player autonomy in the sense that there are certain parts where you are forced to spin dash. further trivializing the role of rolling and limiting the movement options the player has. If you've ever wondered why Sonic 2 versus Sonic 3 and Knuckles is a debate, this is why. Though, to be fair, these are more nitpicks than anything, and it's important to distinguish between nitpicks and bigger issues if you're acknowledging them. What really makes it a nitpick is that while it takes away from some of your options, it also forces you to learn how to spin dash, something that I criticize Sonic 1 for not doing with rolling. Meanwhile, the adventure games limit some of the choices you have to just alternate paths. However, they can also offer too much room for error during cinematic sequences, like I said. Meanwhile, the boost games pretty much only give you autonomy through alternate paths, so the addition of collectibles keeps them from being stale. Finally, let's talk about the last appeal, the need for relatedness. This is definitely the one Sonic dips its toes into the least, and I hate to be the guy to say Sonic is too fast for something, but that's definitely the case with multiplayer in Sonic games. Sonic games literally cannot treat multiple players as equals, so multiplayer is extremely limited in Sonic games for the most part. But multiplayer was an option in the main game mode in the 2D games. Now, remember when I said that they saw the 3D Mario games as kitty crap in Japan? This is why. The third person with camera control style of action game becoming the main type of action game killed couch co-op, and multiplayer wouldn't be included in those types of games until online gaming became a big thing. And that's the thing. Sonic Adventure, Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes, and Sonic 06. Are these kids games? Yes. Sonic 1, 2, 3 and Knuckles, and CD. Are these kids games? Not really. The shift to single-player only experiences isn't the entire reason why 3D Sonic games are geared more towards kids, but you can definitely see a switch. The reason games like this are seen as kids games is because, well, only the kids are playing them. The family isn't playing together like they were with 2D Mario, sorta, and 2D Sonic, sorta. Also, for Sonic 1 and Sonic CD, which don't have multiplayer, 2D games are just easier pick up and play games. While some people want to be immersed in the Sonic world, others just want a quick fun game to play, and there's nothing wrong with either. So these 3D game experiences were mostly had by one person, because most of the game can literally only be experienced by one person. Sure, these games had multiplayer, but these games are already feature-packed enough as is, so it's just lost in the sea of other options. Adults have less time to play video games, but consumers also want the most out of video games. So Sega decided to center everything about the franchise around kids. These weren't pick up and play games, these were games you sit down and play for hours of your childhood, when you have that kind of time. So think about how this paints the perception of the games amongst children versus adults. Here's a good gameplay example. The first time I played Sonic Adventure DX, this happened. No! Now, as a kid, what did I do? I kept playing. I didn't have a whole lot of other games, so I kept playing, and I learned that in order to avoid that, I would need to move farther from the edges of the loop. Meanwhile, an adult playing that would be frustrated that their precious time was wasted by a glitch. They don't have time to dedicate to figuring out how the game works, so they see it, quite understandably, as a flaw getting in their way. That's the problem with these games. So much of the discussion revolves around, well, of course you don't like these games, you're bad at them. But what if they're not bad at the game, but the game is bad at them? And what if the only reason you don't care is because you got used to the jank? When I see two grown men argue over whether Sonic Adventure 2 or Sonic Heroes is better, I see two people who are used to the jank of one game, but not used to the jank of the other. But come on, the classic 2D Sonic games had jank too, right? There's a major distinction to be made here though, and it goes back to the room for error thing I was talking about. In 2D games, there's not that much room for error. In 3D games, there's a lot. When Sonic is being chased by the infamous wall in Sonic 3, you can either go forwards or backwards, and that's your room for error, and it's a challenge that is fairly easy to understand. When Sonic is being chased by the Orca in Sonic Adventure, you can swerve too far off of the jumpy boardwalk due to how slippery the controls are. If you understandably assume that you need to turn, you will be met with death. This could simply be solved by making this section a straight line, as it's a cinematic set piece and did not need to meet anything more than that. And this isn't like a mild annoyance of being hit by something that you can't see in the classic games. You will die and be sent back. The worst part about it is that it doesn't have a challenge, and you end up dying if you understandably assume that it is a challenge. People enjoy these games as an adult because they got used to their jank as children. There's this sentiment going around that people didn't start criticizing or disliking the earlier 3D Sonic games until the straw that was Sonic 06 broke the camel's back. Newsflash, people did, though it maybe wasn't as overblown. But the game still performed well. I wonder what crowd they performed well with. Believe it or not, while you were a child who only talked to other children about video games, adult gamers and critics were calling Sega washed up and Sonic an inherently flawed concept. The childish entitlement to actively avoid understanding why people don't like things you like or like what you don't like is ruling the conversation of Sonic right now. Defending the honor of Sonic is doing the fanbase no favors, and all of the things I've talked about in this video are the reason why. This doesn't mean you're not allowed to like what you like, and as a kid who loved these games too, I understand. But this is precisely why the Sonic fanbase still has a bad reputation. Another example to demonstrate this kind of thing that isn't the gameplay would be how these games tell their stories and their tone. Let's take the scene where Sonic meets Shadow for the first time in Sonic Adventure 2, for example. Through the lens of a child, this is extremely engaging. All of a sudden you see this cool new hedgehog who is essentially more powerful than Sonic, and the plot thickens as you realize he's the reason those strange police were chasing Sonic. That's gotta pull you in. Since you were just Sonic, you saw how fast and powerful and cool he was, and now there's this even more fast and powerful and cool hedgehog, and you want to know why you were being chased. Meanwhile, as an adult, they have experienced the superior rival trope through other media time and time again, so it doesn't have nearly the same effect. Plus, they'll have the ability to nitpick the plot and realize how it makes no sense that Shadow framed Sonic, as they look nothing alike and the game doesn't bother to explain it. The direction that the series' storytelling went and its extremely unsettled dark tone are some of the most clear examples of Sonic pandering towards children. And a lot of people just act like this is Sonic's identity, but it was only really Sonic's identity for those 8 years between 2001 and 2009. While the classic Sonic games had dark themes and aesthetics, they were subtle about it.
In the ultimate insult, the game that was going to make the franchise darker and edgier and more quote-unquote mature was targeted at the one group that was still young enough that they would be self-conscious about that.
It seems that a large portion of the fanbase never grew out of this mindset. The Sonic fanbase is truly the most self-sabotaging fanbase of all time, trying to convince the world that the game that single-handedly destroyed the franchise's reputation is actually some misunderstood masterpiece, and the game that, however briefly, won the rest of the world back with Sonic is complete trash. This is gonna be one of the harshest things I'll say in this video, but Sonic 06 destroyed the reputation of the franchise, and in turn, destroyed the reputation of the fanbase. So just know that when you're actively defending this game, you are defending the thing that made something you love an active laughingstock in you as well. Not to say you can't like the game, but what you want shouldn't be what everyone else gets. The public perception of Sonic matters way more to the reputation of the franchise than whatever one fan personally wants. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to have your opinions though. But a large portion of the Sonic fanbase controlling the conversation around the franchise has this extreme sense of entitlement. When Sonic fans see Sonic 06 as a misunderstood masterpiece and Sonic Colors as childish crap, I see this as a misguided attempt to try to paint Sonic as a more mature series because they're insecure about the fact that they like something aimed at children. Yet, critics love the writing of Sonic Colors, finding it to be a lot more bearable than the melodramatic plots that the series had been going with prior. Grown adults who were fully self-conscious of the fact that they were playing something aimed at kids were less uncomfortable with something like this.
This amusement park has been constructed entirely out of a sense of remorse for my past transgressions, and is in no way associated with any sort of evil plot or premeditated misdeeds.
Well, that's a relief.
Than they were with this.
Whoa, hey.
While kids in their late preteens who are insecure about liking kids stuff will take offense to the writing style of Sonic Colors and see it as an attempt to dumb down the series. And I'm not saying Sonic Colors' writing style is great or anything. The problem is that a huge portion of the fan base that controls the conversation about the series hasn't grown out of this mindset or even has an ounce of self-awareness about it, and are able to sustain an audience of who else? Children, who will of course reaffirm these ideas to the adults who think this way, because children are very impressionable and have a hard time forming their own opinions. It's insane how little self-awareness many of these Sonic fans have as adults. Not all, but a lot of the ones leading the conversation have some childish mentalities without any self-awareness. Like, isn't it strange how Sonic starts sucking around when you turn 14, regardless of what time you grew up in? And this is the case for many fans of the franchise. A lot of the fans whose favorite game was Sonic 3 and Knuckles don't like Sonic Heroes.
I don't know, we all have our own biases. I really don't care for Heroes, but I know this just because I was at the right age where I was sort of too old for, I thought I was growing out of Sonic and stuff.
Sonic Heroes was aimed at inexperienced gamers who'd never played Sonic before, and I was at the perfect age to take it personally that I was no longer the target demographic.
And a lot of the fans whose favorite game was Sonic Adventure 2 don't like Sonic Colors. Yet people think, game sucks, not my fault, not thinking of what you could tolerate as a child versus what you could tolerate as an adult. This tends to be a problem more with the latter group than the former, who can't deal with the fact that they grew up and think Sonic Colors ruined the franchise when it almost revived the franchise's reputation. There's nothing wrong with not liking a game for these reasons, it's perfectly valid, but when you go around telling other people that the franchise was ruined because a certain game came out when you felt like you had grown out of the series, that's a problem. If anyone takes anything out of this video, I really want Sonic fans to start being more self-aware about their and others' opinions on the franchise. It would make being a Sonic fan suck way less. Going back, what's wrong with Sonic being for kids? Well, let me ask that question again for another game series. Is Mario for kids? No, it's for families. And that's the thing. Sonic was made to compete with Mario, and it actually did a good job at that. The Sega Genesis was marketed towards older gamers, but not only that, Sonic succeeded by being more accessible than Mario. The whole spiel about the difficulty of Sonic vs. Mario earlier really puts into perspective why Sonic was able to actually compete with Mario. An idea that seems baffling today, but it shows why the series was so popular. Critics believe that Sonic's quote-unquote gimmick limits the series, but Sonic isn't about speed, and its mechanics are so strong and help make the game so accessible. Today though, that's not the case. Mario has warmed itself into many hearts and homes for prioritizing family fun instead of being something to just babysit the kids with. When the two 3D Mario games received their backlash in Japan, they went back to 2D to win back the audience they lost and tried to make the 3D games more accessible since they could then. You aren't judged as an adult for liking Mario games like you are for liking Sonic games. But this is a moot point, right? That was just 30 years ago. That's all over, right? Well, recently, Sega's general manager, Osamu Ohashi, said after the release of what is currently the most recent Sonic game that he still wants Sonic to surpass Mario. Let's check and see how they did that. Oh. But that's the thing. Sonic isn't supposed to be niche and is much better off in the eyes of the general public when it doesn't try to be. The stigma around the series comes from its perceived nicheness. That sucks as an adult Sonic fan, but also, the time has long passed for Sonic to be seen as something not weird for adults to like. That's not to say that everything niche inherently has a bad rep, but Sonic obviously does for the reason that it's not supposed to be niche, yet is. It's even more off-putting. Like, take for example a film like Fantastic Planet. Great film within the niche, but a majority of people probably wouldn't understand it or stomach it. That being said, I don't think a lot of people would judge you for liking it. Or, let's keep this closer to Sonic in video games. Nights into Dreams. It's a very niche game that doesn't even remotely resemble any other genre, and while that doesn't mean a more casual audience couldn't enjoy the game, some might find it too confusing. Sonic isn't supposed to be niche. This comment I received on my Sonic Adventure prototype video, plug, pretty much sums up the problem. But for context first, in the video I say that Sonic X-treme would have been the Sonic 06 of 1996. Sonic X-treme was an unreleased game that would have been in a very unfinished state if it had been released when it was scheduled to. The comment reads, I agree that X-treme would be the 06 of the 90s, but only in the way that 06 is one of the best and most imaginative Sonic games with quirks that are sadly too much to get used to for most people. It would also be like Lost World in that regard, which even if unintentionally became a direct successor to X-treme. I wish games in general would stop trying to be good, which is impossible with how subjective art is anyway, and would just do whatever they wanted instead. That way we would get less manias, also known as stale bread, and more Lost Worlds and Extremes with all the fisheye lenses in the world. But I understand that a product must return stales to be profitable, and even all that creativity was accidental in an attempt to garner mass appeal. I just prefer it when art is a bit more hostile to the audience instead of pandering to them. But that's not Sonic. And there's a place for both niche art and art that appeals to everyone. While there's different ideas of what Sonic is supposed to be, and I'll get to that, being niche certainly isn't part of it. Also, saying the game made by fans has less artistic integrity than the entirely corporate created game is insane. But Sonic has become a niche thing, and even worse, it has its own niches within it. Let's talk about this Sonic, and this Sonic, and this Sonic. I love all these Sonics. But what consistently gets brought up as the source for the series' broken fan base is the fact that it was split into so many different sectors. Sonic was made to appeal to Western audiences, but Sega of America was just too worried that Sonic didn't have enough edge to him. Thus, they redesigned Sonic and created their own universe for Sonic and Friends to inhabit. But despite looking dated to our eyes now, the in-your-face approach of the Western interpretation produced great results for Sega. Now, if this sounds like it would cause decades of confusion and a broken base, it did. Thus, we saw the rise of fans who were confused and felt betrayed that they changed Robotnik's name to Eggman, or when they moved Sonic from Mobius to inhabiting a world with a bunch of humans. At the same time, there was always this sect of Western fans who knew about the original Japanese canon. The weebs of the fan base, if you will. The JP purists. The Sega Sonic fans. They would go around spreading the gospel about how there was this obscure arcade game we never got where Sonic had these friends we've never heard of. Or how there was this cool and interesting island lore in the Japanese manuals. But this didn't just extend to the fan base. Western developers were making games alongside Japanese developers. Western developers were making a game about Sonic the Hedgehog, who was of course originally a normal hedgehog named Sonny, fighting Dr. Robotnik, who of course was originally the benevolent Dr. Kentober on planet Mobius, while Japanese developers were making a game about Sonic the Hedgehog from Christmas Island, fighting Dr. Eggman on West Side Island. This is another reason why I'm glad that Sonic X-treme was cancelled, because it was developed by Western developers with the Western canon in mind, and the two interpretations could not coexist into the internet age, and with games becoming more complex. So the Japanese canon was adopted worldwide, And while it caused problems, it gave the franchise focus. And the Western interpretations never went away, as they would continue to appear in external media like TV shows and comics. But here's the thing. As much as Sonic Adventure brought the Japanese canon over to the West, it still changed a lot of things. The funny thing is that when Sega of America redesigned Sonic to give him more edge, Yuji Naka got upset about it. Then he did the exact same thing. He thought the edge was being taken out of Sonic, so the artist redesigned him to be cooler. So while Sonic Adventure brought over the Japanese canon, it changed a lot. The characters looked different, the robots looked different, and while there were humans present to some extent in Sonic before, it was jarring to go from islands with nothing but wildlife to bustling cities filled with mankind. And Sonic Adventure 2 took the series even further away from the recognizable elements of its past. The tropical islands and dreamy locations are pretty much completely gone, and the world of Sonic is the most realistic it's ever been. The recognizable robots modeled after animals are completely gone, replaced with mechs, and the characters no longer feel like cartoon animals thanks to the move away from wildlife settings into cities, and they now lean almost entirely on the superhero aspect of the characters. These games may have brought the Japanese canon over to the West, but they also retooled the series heavily in an attempt to make it cooler. And that's cool. Sonic is a very versatile character, so you can create almost any situation to put the character in. Different interpretations are a good thing. It's exactly why superheroes are so popular. And there's plenty to love about these different interpretations of the character, and you're definitely entitled to your favorite. Archie Sonic used to be my favorite as a kid. There's not one thing that Sonic is supposed to be. But here's the thing. Both of these different versions of Sonic tried to make it cooler and edgier, when it was already cool and edgy. This can often result in that edginess overload that the franchise gets understandably mocked for. As great as it is that there were different interpretations of the series, the original Japanese Sonic was perfect as is. While American Sonic is associated with Ken Pender's numerous controversies and modern Sonic is associated with... The original interpretation has the best reputation and isn't associated with anything negative. The most universally agreed to be good part of the franchise was that original Mega Drive Genesis era of games. But sometimes the original Japanese Sonic gets the reputation of being more soft and friendly and much less edgy. But that isn't true. It was just more subtle. While the other two versions of Sonic spout out corny one-liners to remind you how cool they are, not saying that there's anything wrong with that, this version showed it, but didn't tell. He would get upset with you and tap his foot. His face always had a look of determination. He didn't love them hoes. Oh, so that's why Snoop Dogg likes Sonic. But the seeds for future incarnations of Sonic were planted in Sonic 3, where he always has this smirk on his face, lacking that determined look and genuine anger in his idle animation, seemingly taking elements from the Western interpretation and setting the stage for his cocky incarnation in the adventure games. Ironically, after redesigning Sonic to bring the edge back to him, it seems that Sega regretted the decision and toned the attitude down to a bare minimum for a while. But going back to the idea of the franchise becoming solely a kid series, I think more people like the subtler attitude that the original incarnations of Sonic had, as opposed to the one-liner spouting incarnation that appeals mostly to kids. Not that there's anything wrong with that incarnation or liking it, and this was mostly just nitpicking to try to explain why Sonic as a character appealed to kids and older audiences in the first place. It's not just the character, but I think every aspect of the original classic Sonic surpasses the others in the eyes of the general public. The character designs, the artistic flourishes, the box art quotes, the settings, the stories, the musical identity, the simple 2D gameplay, the accessible mechanics. Sonic was pretty much perfect from the start. This isn't meant to be me being a purist or anything. Like I said, different interpretations are good. I just wanted to explain what appealed to so many people about Sonic in the first place that made it the biggest video game series in the early 90s, and how that was lost in the attempts to make the series more edgy. And that goes back to the whole thing of Sonic losing its family appeal to become solely a kid series. And those things I just listed are why I think Sonic appealed to so many people in the first place. Taking it back to trios, I think the appeal came down to what 3 people did. The 3 people credited with creating Sonic in the first place: Naoto Oshima, Yuji Naka, and Hirokazu Yasuhara. Naoto Oshima is the person I would consider to be the definitive original creator of Sonic. He drew the initial character. If we go by the logic that if you contribute to fleshing out the character, that means you took part in creating the character, then hundreds of people have created Sonic. So I think that Naoto Oshima does deserve the primary credit for creating Sonic. But he didn't create the Sonic we know today. See, his strength is in character design, but not much else. His initial version of Sonic was originally set in a generic surreal fantasy world, which reused elements from another concept he was working on for a game called Twin Stars. Now, it looks nice and it probably would have been a fun game, but you have to realize that games like this were literally everywhere thanks to the influence of Super Mario Bros. And that style was just popular in general. Naoto Oshima's original vision for Sonic the Hedgehog would have surely failed as a game, even if it was good. That's why when Yuji Naka proposed that the character have more of an attitude and a subtle environmental message, replacing the fantasy monsters with robots, it really helped to make the series stand out. Now, given that Yuji Naka tends to be unreliable and very egotistical, it's unknown how much of a role he actually played in shaping Sonic compared to Sega of America, but it's still important that these elements help the series stand out. But we do know he was inspired to create this speedy momentum-based platforming-based adventure because he was attracted to the idea of speedrunning games and improving your skills as you play more. And it was Hirokazu Yasuhara who fleshed this out and created the gameplay we know and love today. Looking at Oshima's knack for appealing character design combined with Naka's marketing skills and Yasuhara's game design skill, it's easy to understand what made Sonic as big as it was in the 90s. Unfortunately, that can be taken apart when you strip out one of these elements. That's not to say you can't make a good Sonic game without these 3 people, that's obviously not true, and the only games that all 3 had involvement in were Sonic 1 and the Traveler's Tales games, but back then they didn't lose sight of the fact that all these aspects worked better together. So I explained what made Sonic so beloved in the first place. And this goes back to the one common criticism of the series that I ignored when I was first talking about them. The idea that Sonic is inherently flawed. But I just disproved that. The series works on so many levels. So what went wrong? The reason so many people think Sonic is inherently flawed is because Sega gave them a reason to think that. You get a couple good games in the 90s, you get the 3D games where they don't go all the way with the gameplay style that the game is based around, and then a massive overblown flop. And guess how they recover? Not by starting from the drawing board and doing what they should have done this whole time, but by screaming, "We are desperate, we are out of ideas." Make him a werewolf, give him a sword. So many people don't understand why Sonic Unleashed was met with so much backlash back in the day because we are so far removed from the historical context. While I will absolutely acknowledge that this backlash went way overboard, people were absolutely sick of Sega's shit. And given that it looked that Sega had run out of ideas, critics and the general public just saw Sonic as a one-trick pony whose sole gimmick was going fast with an attitude that was better left in the corporate marketing of the 90s. Sonic doesn't have the same reputation as something with as many missteps as, say, Star Wars, because Sega not only destroyed the reputation of the series, but during the process, they destroyed the reputation of the series' legacy. A lot of fans like to think that critics are just harsh to Sonic for stuff that other games get away with just because it's Sonic. But I just disprove that. Why would anyone have a vitriolic response to Sonic for no reason? Criticism and even nitpicking should be completely fine. There's nothing wrong with criticizing the Sonic series. It's how Sega responds to it. Because when people make legitimate statements of constructive criticism, Sega overcorrects. When people understandably criticize the way Sega goes about implementing multiple characters in the Sonic games, they base their whole marketing around how this game only has Sonic and none of the other characters even make as much of an appearance. The criticism isn't the problem, it's Sega's reaction to it, and the problem with the series is how Sega handles it. So, does this mean you shouldn't criticize Sonic? No, and the fanbase should stop acting like it does. The end. I hope this video gives people insight. Maybe you learned something. Maybe I got you to think about something differently, even if you still disagree. And that's great. I wish everyone a lovely day. Like, dislike, subscribe, unsubscribe, comment, banana. Fuck, I'm tired.